Hamilton and Sons Bank was one of the oldest and most prestigious financial institutions in New York. It prided itself on its elite clientele and old money traditions. Among its senior employees was Richard Caldwell, a middle-aged banker who had been with the company for nearly 2 decades. He was efficient, knowledgeable, and respected, but he was also arrogant, entitled, and, though never openly admitted, deeply prejudiced. Richard had always believed certain people simply didn't belong in establishments like his bank. He viewed them as beneath him, undeserving of wealth, power, or respect. He never outright voiced these thoughts, but his actions spoke louder than words. He would be extra polite to wealthy white clients, offering them coffee and conversation, but when a black or minority customer walked in, his demeanor changed. He became cold, impatient, and dismissive. On a particularly rainy afternoon, Richard sat at his desk, going over mortgage applications, when the bank's front doors swung open. An elderly black man stepped inside, shaking the rain from his coat. His suit, while neat and well-pressed, had seen better days. He carried a weathered leather briefcase and moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the world change many times. Richard barely looked up before making his judgment. The man didn't belong here. The elderly man approached Richard's desk. "Good afternoon, young man," he said with a warm smile. "I'd like to speak to the branch manager, if you don't mind." Richard sighed, setting down his pen with exaggerated annoyance. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I believe my business is quite important," the man replied. Richard smirked. "I doubt that." The man chuckled, clearly amused by Richard's attitude. "Still, I'd like to speak with whoever is in charge." Richard leaned back in his chair and folded his arms. "Look, I don't know what you're hoping to get here, but this isn't the kind of bank that just hands out loans to, well, anyone." The warmth in the elderly man's eyes dimmed slightly. "And what exactly do you mean by anyone?" Richard hesitated for just a moment before scoffing. "I mean people who don't have the proper financial background, people who waste my time with requests that won't be approved." A hush fell over the bank as several employees stopped what they were doing to glance at the scene unfolding. The security guard by the door shifted uncomfortably, and the young receptionist at the front desk looked away, pretending to focus on her computer. The elderly man nodded slowly, as if he had heard this kind of talk many times before. "I see," he said. "And you are?" "Richard Caldwell," he replied, straightening his tie. "Senior banker. I've been here for nearly 20 years. "Ah," the man said. "Well, Mr. Caldwell, it seems you and I will be working together quite often." Richard frowned. "Excuse me?" Just then, the assistant manager, Helen, rushed toward them. She looked flustered, her usual calm demeanor shaken. "Mr. Carter," she exclaimed, "I'm so sorry for the delay. We weren't expecting you until later." Richard's heart stopped. "Mr. Carter?" Helen turned to Richard, her expression somewhere between disbelief and fury. "Mr. Caldwell, do you even know who you're speaking to?" Richard felt a cold sweat forming. "This," Helen continued, "is Benjamin Carter, the new majority owner of Hamilton and Sons Bank." The words struck like a thunderclap. Richard stared at the elderly man in shock, suddenly seeing him in a whole new light. Benjamin Carter. The name was legendary in the business world. A self-made billionaire, Carter had built his wealth through smart investments, real estate, and sheer perseverance, and Richard had just insulted him. Mr. Carter studied Richard, his expression unreadable. "It's interesting," he said, his voice even. "I've spent my entire career dealing with people like you, people who assume they can judge someone's worth just by looking at them." Richard swallowed hard. "Mr. Carter, Mr. Carter held up a hand, silencing him. "Save it," he said. "I didn't come here for apologies. I came here to make changes." The tension in the room was suffocating. Every employee stood frozen, waiting for the inevitable. Mr. Carter turned to Helen. "Effective immediately, I want a full review of the staff. Anyone who doesn't align with the values of this institution will be removed. We will not tolerate discrimination in any form." Helen nodded, stealing a glance at Richard, who was now pale. "As for Mr. Caldwell," Mr. Carter continued, turning back to him, "pack your things." Your services are no longer required. Richard felt his legs weaken. Sir, please, I built my empire by recognizing talent and eliminating poison, Carter said. And you, Mr. Caldwell, are poison. There was no arguing, no begging, no second chances. Richard, who had spent years looking down on others, had now been put in his place. As he gathered his things in silence, he could feel the eyes of his colleagues on him. Some pitied him, others looked relieved. As he walked toward the exit, he passed by Mr. Carter, who stood tall, unshaken. Lesson of the day, Mr. Caldwell, Carter said. Always know who you're talking to. And with that, the doors to Hamilton and Sons Bank closed behind Richard Caldwell for the last time.